Hello and welcome back to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, starting out with the Ukrainian counteroffensive that is soon to end. In the direction of Donetsk, we see that the Ukrainian forces managed to advance a small bit to the east of Minefields in the direction of Pervomaiske. So here we see that the Ukrainian forces launched a small-scale attack. This managed to break through the Russian forces in this direction and push them back to backward positions, and they managed to capture these positions before retreating behind to their pre-established positions. So the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces are doing some back and forth tug of war in this direction, as the Russian forces managed to advance a couple of months back, and then the Ukrainian forces are now counterattacking in this direction. Not a big one, but just a small-scale one to get some of these territories that the Russians had neglected over the past few weeks. Then we see in the direction of the Robotina area, we see that the Ukrainian forces started an attack in the direction of the west of Robotina, where here they are storming the trenches of Kopani and Robotina here to the west, and they are trying here to assault these trenches and capture them. We're seeing reports from the Russian forces in the area that the Ukrainian forces started these attacks just a few hours ago, and that heavy fighting is ongoing over them. This is likely not a large contingent of troops, but a mid-sized one, not the usual 5-people squad launching an attack, but a decent-sized company trying to assault these trenches and capture some of them in an assault. And the Russian forces are responding with heavy artillery and with the soldiers fighting within the trenches, replying to the Ukrainian forces advancing on their positions. So there's some fighting going on here to the west of Robotina, and at the same time we hear a report from Remy where he says that the Russian forces managed to advance 2 kilometers from the outskirts of the village of Novorokopivka. So the outskirts of the village is around here, and 2 kilometers is the trenches here to the south of Robotina. So according to Remy, the fighting is ongoing by the trenches to the south of Robotina, at the same time as the Ukrainian forces are attacking the trenches west of Robotina. So there's heavy fighting by Robotina right now, not the village itself, but the trenches in the south and west of it, as heavy fighting is ongoing for the geographical positions that these positions entail. With the trenches in these heights here to the south of Robotina, the Russian forces would be able to attack the Ukrainian forces advancing in the direction of Verbove, where the Ukrainian forces are also launching attacks in the direction of Verbove as they continue their attempts at capturing the trenches, which are all situated in the low ground. Here in the southern parts, they are located in the high grounds, which gives the Russian forces an advantage as they hold these trenches here in the high ground, allowing them to prevent further Ukrainian advances in this direction. So the general situation here in the south is that the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces are both clashing with their own initiative. The Russian forces here to the south of Robotina and the Ukrainian forces in the flanks of their currently held positions. The situation is generally very dynamic, as is written in this article by Danish news outlet TV2. And from this, we see the headline. This was written a little over a week ago. Counteroffensive is in extremely dynamic phase. Expert sees signs that must worry Russia. So throughout this article, they talk about the current situation, give a recap as to how the Ukrainian forces over 3.5 to 4 months decided to launch this offensive, managed to reach the first line of defense. However, they come with this weird claim that the Robotina is ahead of the Surovikin line. And this makes no sense, as is written by this Defense UA article, which is a defense journal on the Ukrainian side, where they write that Ukraine's troops broken through the Russian defenses near Robotina, but the assault on the Surovikin line will begin only now. This was written on August 28th, and that is because the dubbed Surovikin line is the first main line of defense. That is not this weird magical line that the Western media created just to give the Ukrainians some PR victory, because there's no defensive line here. There are trenches, there are defensive positions, there are minefields, but there's not a defensive line. The first defensive line is, as is written here, the Surovikin line, which goes from the Dnieper River and all the way to east to the Remevsky Lech area. So this Ukrainian media writes about the Surovikin line and the defenses here that the Ukrainians had to break through. At the same time, we see this quote-unquote expert in this Western media article talking about how the Ukrainians have significantly weakened the artillery material at Russia's disposal, and that they are in a phase now where the Ukrainians must try to get more artillery material through the defense line. If they succeed, it could potentially mean that Ukraine will be able to move south faster than it is doing now. But this makes no sense. It only makes sense because they claim they've broken through the Surovikin line. However, that is not the case. The Ukrainian forces have breached it, but have not managed to actually break through. And the difference here is that if they had broken through, then they would be able to transport some of the artillery and other units across the defensive line. But they're still fighting over the trenches here beyond the first defensive line, which is the anti-tank ditches and the concrete fortifications. So with this information, we see that this claim is really weird because it makes no sense. At the same time, we see that the fighting has been going really slow, as they mentioned here, and then they could say that at the end of August, it emerged that the Ukrainians had recaptured the town of Robotina, which is smaller but strategically important town as it lies behind the first part of the strong Surovikin line. So again here, behind the first part. It's not behind it, it is ahead of it. The Surovikin line is here, and that is Robotina. It is kilometers away. But yeah, so this whole analysis is based on wrong facts, which is what makes it really weird. Then he says later on, he mentions here how observers should be patient and should expect Ukraine's counteroffensive to continue through the winter of 2023 and into the spring of 2024. Again, this is based on information that is really weird, probably taken from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, because here it assumes that the Ukrainian forces are able to continue their offensive through the winter of 2023 and into the spring of 2024. They have lost a lot of units over these 4 months of fighting, and we're still in the fall season. At this pace, the Ukrainians will run out of soldiers before they enter the spring of 2024, much less be able to continue it in that time. So with this, it makes no sense. Ukraine does not need to achieve a sudden, dramatic, and deep breakthrough to achieve success, writes the think tank. It is impossible to say how long it will take for the Ukrainians to reach Tokmak, but it is clear that it is Ukrainians who are advancing now, while the Russians are struggling to defend themselves. A cautious guess is that during the next week, Ukraine will have taken over the town of Novoprokopivka. So, first off, he says the Russians are struggling to defend themselves, yet for over a month they managed to hold back the Ukrainian forces between the main line of defense and the trenches beyond it, still holding Verbove. The Ukrainian forces have not managed to gain a foothold within Verbove, and after a month, if this is how the Russians are struggling, then I would not want to see what they're doing if they're actually strong. And at the same time, we hear him claim in a week's time, which was a week ago this article was written, in a week's time, a cautious guess, so that means there would be a safe bet, a safe guess, would be that the Ukrainians capture Novoprokopivka. Yet again, the Ukrainians have not yet gotten a foothold within Novoprokopivka. So if this is Russia struggling, then I would not want to watch Russia having a good time, having a strong defense, because them struggling is already beyond Ukraine's capabilities. And this weirdness doesn't stop here, because we go on to see the headline "Clear Upper Hand," as he claims that Ukraine has taken over the advantage of artillery fire, which is again a weird claim. Russia has about 7-1 advantage in this. In June, Ukraine started purposely bombing Russia's artillery positions. Well, that is what you do in a war. You purposefully bomb the opponent's artillery positions. This hasn't happened in June. This has happened from February 2022. It's nothing new. And then somehow that has significantly weakened the Russian artillery. Why would that suddenly happen? That's not something that suddenly happens. It's something that happens over a long period of time. It is attrition. This whole war has been ongoing in a battle of attrition since January. And that is 9 months, 10 months now. Not suddenly in June. And then finally, he talks about how the first line of defense consisted of minefields, The second line of defense consists of armored barricades and a large number of tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and artillery. First off, artillery shouldn't be counted because artillery is always present on the battlefield, because no matter how far away, they are located in areas where they can actually launch attacks on the opponent. So therefore, artillery is always there. It's not something that suddenly appears at the second line of defense. It is at the first, second, third, fourth, and the fifth lines of defense. The same with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles. Here, he essentially claims that the Ukrainians and Russians would face head-on, face-to-face on the second line of defense. But again, this makes no sense, because the Russians have already prepared minefields all the way from the first line of defense and down to Tokmak. And of this, they have switched around the organization of these minefields to have a part anti-personnel mines, and then they have anti-tank mines, and then they have anti-personnel mines. So this is AP for anti-personnel, AT for anti-tank, and AP for anti-personnel. So this means the Ukrainians will have to go over the main line of defense with their tanks, establish positions, capture the trenches, then launch infantry-based assaults across this whole distance, open fields, before being able to use their tanks again, because the anti-tank mines are so dense that, similarly to the first original 3 months of fighting, where every time the Ukrainians launched an armored convoy, they ended up losing the whole thing into these mines and artillery fires throughout the front. So this will just repeat itself, because it is the exact same situations. The Russians are not short on mines. They have plenty to go around, and they have mined the whole area, leaving no chance for Ukraine to launch an armored assault, because if they do so, their mine-clearing vehicles will get destroyed by the Russian artillery and air force, after which they'll get stuck within minefields to get hit by artillery. Just like we have seen from the start, the situation hasn't changed. The Ukrainians have not gotten any super weapons to just get rid of all the mines in one fell swoop. That doesn't exist, and therefore, it's like the whole concept of the Ukrainians just being able to walk through mines doesn't make sense. The Ukrainian soldiers reportedly said, when they were being trained by German soldiers in Germany, if we get in front of a minefield with our Leopard tanks, how do we get through them? And the Germans just said, go around. Like, how will they go around if the minefields expands all the way through the first main line of defense? This whole area is mined. They can't just go around it. Like, they have no solution. Nothing was planned and nothing is in effect. The Ukrainians are just slowly passing through with their units that mix well with these mines. In tanks when it's anti-personnel mines, and personnel when it's anti-tank mines. However, this leads to a slow advance and a lot of casualties, because the slower it is, the longer time the Russians have to just strike them with artillery. And that is the situation. The Ukrainians cannot just suddenly break through, like he claims. Even if the Ukrainians had 10-1 artillery advantage, they would not be able to just walk through the minefields. They would have to clear them, and that would take enough time. For if the Russians had only a tenth of the Ukrainian artillery, if they're outside the Ukrainian artillery range, then they can just strike the Ukrainian forces from positions where the Ukrainian artillery cannot reach, and therefore they'll still have their artillery to use while the Ukrainians are clearing the minefields. So the Ukrainians need some sort of new solution to clear these minefields, because the current rate and the current operation is not working for the Ukrainians, as they're just taking too much time and taking too much casualties to actually succeed with this offensive. So the claim that it will go on until winter and spring and so on, even if that happens, it will just be a continuous attrition, and that is expecting Russia to not do anything despite recruiting 350,000 new troops throughout 2023, and they expect it to reach 500,000. So with 500,000 new troops by the 2024, the Russians will definitely have such a enormous advantage that they will be able to just steamroll the Ukrainian forces, because in the end they spent up all their forces trying to walk through minefields with nothing to clear them. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.